It's something I have personally struggled with, and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. Hey friends, welcome back. This video has been in the works for a long time, probably over a year. If you followed me for any amount of time, you know I talk a lot about decluttering. I've shared stories about how I've decluttered every area of my home and saw substantial results. But one area that I've never talked about here is one area that we all have no matter who you are or where you live. It's an area that we use extensively every single day. And maybe mine is more cluttered than yours, but I am willing to bet that yours could benefit from a good declutter too. The area I want to talk about today is our minds. When you think about it, our mind really is the most valuable thing that we all have. It helps us reason, it helps us problem solve, it helps us in every single interaction we have with other people. So maybe it's time that we started investing in making sure it isn't too cluttered. I've talked before about how spaces that contain too much clutter don't function at their full capacity, and that often causes stress. And for the purposes of this video, I'm not referring to any conditions that you should see a medical professional for. I'm simply referring to having an unnecessarily cluttered mind, which I would dare say a lot of us have. In the world that we live in today, we are constantly faced with input. Much of this contributes to the clutter in our minds. We see billboards and advertisements everywhere, including right in the palm of our hand. We are so bombarded with input all the time. Never before has this been as big of an issue as it is now. And not all of it is bad. There is so much good information available to us, but many of us try to take in all of the good information, and we aspire to do all the things, and we can't miss out on anything. I'm not proposing that we all become like Thoreau and live off the grid, but I do want to propose some tips that I have found useful in helping me have a less cluttered mind. Number one, I try to be mindful of the amount of information that I allow into my brain. I have shared before that I've unsubscribed from most promotional emails. And since doing that, I've become extra aware of things that are less obvious, but that are trying to sell me something. As Greg McEwen put it, everyone is selling something, an idea, a viewpoint, an opinion, in exchange for your time. Simply being aware of what is being sold allows us to be more deliberate in deciding whether we want to buy it. A few years ago, I signed up for parenting emails. I figured it would help me become a better parent. And while I enjoy these emails sometimes, more often than not, they just become something that I set aside to read when I have time. Something else to do. And so I usually open them in a new tab to get to later, which really isn't a bad strategy in and of itself, except for I do that with a lot of things. An interesting article I want to read, a podcast that was recommended to me that I'll get to later, and on and on and on. And then my mind feels like a browser with too many tabs open. Even though all of these things that I aspire to get to are good, I've realized that I am not going to miss out entirely. These parenting emails are not the only source of good parenting information that I'm going to get. These podcasts are not the only way that I'm going to learn something new. Being mindful of the amount of things I allow into my brain is an ongoing process for sure, but it is something I have noticed a huge difference with. For me personally, it has been unsubscribing from a lot of things, limiting my social media usage, limiting my news consumption, just to name a few. Maybe for you, you don't need to do any of those things. Maybe you are better at being able to filter out that excess information. But for me, I have found that physically doing something different for the sake of my mind has been immensely helpful. And in conjunction with that, tip number two, I am working on allowing myself to declare backlog bankruptcy. This was a concept I read about several months ago that I am fascinated with. I'll link some articles below, but the concept is that a lot of us have a list of things that we want to look into or read or listen to, and that list just keeps getting longer and longer, and it adds mental clutter. The author of the article put it this way: we all keep lists of games, movies, bands, or other media we're interested in checking out someday, but sometimes those lists of unexperienced media can feel like debt, dragging us down as more is added to the pile. So the author is referring to media, but it can also be other things too. This resonated so much with me because I do this all the time. Obviously, there are things that have to go on our to-do list, but being mindful about things that we have to get to versus things that we just want to get to is a pretty important distinction to make. And honestly, I think part of this has to do with FOMO, or fear of missing out. If we don't read this book that everyone else has read and is talking about, we won't be able to talk about it with our friends, and we'll be the odd one out. If we don't look into this parenting article, we won't be as good of a parent. If we don't spend a lot of time looking at the news, we won't be in the know and we won't be as educated about the world around us. Not only did these things weigh on our mind because we have this growing list of things that we have to get to, but a lot of the time there is a digital trail that's left behind, like my screenshots of things I want to get to, or the browser on my phone with dozens of tabs open. The author of the article I referenced a moment ago goes on to say, those growing backlogs do have a negative mental impact on some of us. There's now a strong body of scientific evidence showing digital clutter can be just as stressful as physical junk, and backlogs are one of the biggest sources of digital clutter we can accumulate. So here's my proposition. We give ourselves permission to delete those screenshots, close those tabs, do whatever we have to do to give ourselves the space to declare backlog bankruptcy. I have been so intrigued by this idea of backlog bankruptcy, so I looked into it further and I found a second article unrelated to the first about the same idea. The author of the second article talked about working as a product manager for a company that was trying to develop an enterprise software product. He said every day he was handling feedback from customers, employees, the team developing the product, consultants, etc. He was fielding feature requests and problems with the product and everything in between. He consistently added all of that to a backlog. And he quickly realized that there was no way that he and his team were ever going to be able to get to everything. After being so frustrated for months, he and his boss decided together that they were going to declare backlog bankruptcy. They deleted the records of everything in that backlog. And it was so interesting to hear what he had to say about what happened next. He said, but then something interesting happened. There were no repercussions from that decision. And I got a sense of relief after eliminating the cognitive overhead created by the backlog. And after ruthlessly prioritizing and limiting what we added to the backlog, we got the product to market faster. Starting from scratch felt good. The lesson declaring backlog bankruptcy taught me was that if an idea has enough value for customers, it will come back. It will bubble up to the top. I no longer keep massive lists of all the ideas and things I want to do in the future. Sometimes the simplicity this creates in your product is a positive experience for customers. It also taught me more about the purpose of the product backlog. It's not a place for every future opportunity. We needed to have a process around what gets added to the backlog. I think as we try to declutter our minds, it will become naturally more obvious what things need to be added to our personal backlog and what things are just adding mental clutter. Tip number 3. I am trying to give myself more time to just be. This sometimes is just looking out the window or staring into space, as my 5th grade teacher called it, or even just
stare into the abyss.
We live in a society that places a pretty high value on hustle culture, or the idea that productivity and moving ahead in life comes before our well-being. A couple of years ago, my husband's work had a company-wide outage, and none of their employees were able to access their internal systems for several minutes. My husband, who was working remotely from home at the time, told me about the outage later in the day, and I asked him what he did during that time. He said, I looked out the window. Do you know how long it's been since I just stared out the window? I laughed at how innocent his response sounded, but really it stayed with me because I feel like this was a representation of life for most of us. When do we ever just sit and stare out the window? Most of us don't make time to do this on an ongoing basis, and most of us say we don't even have time to do this. But I have been trying to make a conscious effort to do this more often. My kids have what's called a brain break at school, and I think us as adults could benefit from something similar. I am a firm believer that not constantly putting things into your brain is a form of self-care. I think that when we let our brains rest from stimulation and input, it gives them some much needed time to process and regulate. I recently read an article from the New York Times on this very thing, and the author also proposed that the brain's need for rest is so important. Idleness is not just a vacation, an indulgence, or a vice. It is as indispensable to the brain as vitamin D is to the body, and deprived of it, we suffer a mental affliction as disfiguring as rickets. The space and quiet that idleness provides is a necessary condition for standing back from life and seeing it whole, for making unexpected connections and waiting for the wild summer lightning strikes of inspiration. It is paradoxically necessary to getting any work done. One simple way I've been putting this into practice for myself is I've been working on not reaching for my phone every time I'm bored or have downtime. Tip number 4, I have been putting a high priority on sleep. This is another valuable resource that many of us underutilize. And yes, I did just refer to sleep as a resource. As I've begun getting older, it is more obvious than ever that I can't pull an all-nighter like I could when I was a college girl studying for finals. Now, I haven't tried to pull an all-nighter recently, but I have made the mistake of staying up to get more things done, and then I feel groggy and slow the next day. And I'm convinced that I am far less productive than had I just gone to bed when I was tired, instead of trying to push my body and stay up too late. Since having kids, I have been very interested in the concept of sleep. I move heaven and earth to make sure my kids get to bed early enough and that they have the ideal conditions conducive to them getting enough sleep. But recently, I have been reading up on the importance of sleep for myself. I found an article that was particularly interesting to me, and it was called The Extraordinary Importance of Sleep. I'll link it below, but it talked in essence about the evolution of sleep research and what we know about sleep. The article quoted Dr. David F. Dinges, who is an expert on sleep. He has done a lot of research on sleep and how it affects everything in our body. He said, modern industrial pressures to use time 24 hours a day have led to shift work and a world in which virtually everything operates 24/7. People have come to value time so much that sleep is often regarded as an annoying interference, a wasteful state that you enter into when you do not have enough willpower to work harder and longer. We know for sure that sleep serves multiple functions. Nature tends to be very parsimonious in that it often uses a single system or biology in multiple ways to optimize the functioning of an organism. We know, for example, that sleep is critical for waking cognition, that is, for the ability to think clearly, to be vigilant and alert, and sustain attention. We also know that memories are consolidated during sleep and that sleep serves a key role in emotional regulation. For the last couple of years, I have tried to prioritize sufficient sleep over nighttime productivity. It has made all the difference. I feel better when I wake up, and I'm able to wake up earlier. For me, an hour of time in the morning after sufficient rest is worth about 2 or 3 hours of trying to be productive and burning the midnight oil, so to say. I love this quote by Brené Brown. She said, "It takes courage to say yes to rest and play in a culture where exhaustion is seen as a status symbol." I am in no means here to tell you how many hours of sleep you should be getting. You are the best judge of how much sleep you truly need. But as I have tuned into my sleep needs and made adequate sleep a priority, it has trickled into every aspect of my life. Sleep has made such a huge difference in helping me declutter my mind. Now, I recognize that there are times and seasons for all things. There are seasons where we don't have the ability to get a good night's sleep. Whether you have a newborn, or you're working multiple jobs, or you're taking care of a loved one, whatever it may be. But the takeaway here is to look at sleep as a resource and a non-negotiable instead of as a disposable annoyance. Tip number 5, write things down. This will help you relieve some of that burden on your mind. When we tell ourselves, I'm going to remember that, and I'm constantly doing that with multiple things all the time, it creates a lot of stress and clutter for our brains. Writing things down not only relieves some of that clutter, but it helps us not forget things that are important. Another way that writing things down is helpful is to do what Greg McEwen calls a 6-minute free write. He says, get a blank piece of paper and write this question on the top. What is the most important thing I need to do today? Then start a 6-minute timer and free write anything that comes into your head. Look at the ideas you have written, and you will start to see clarity in what initially appears to be chaos. Connect the dots and identify the most important thing you need to do today. You may have also heard of this being referred to as a brain dump. Getting many of the thoughts out of your head and onto paper can not only be therapeutic, but it can also help clue you in on some of the main things that are causing your brain to feel so cluttered. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. What are some things that you have done to declutter your brain that others might find helpful? Thanks for watching, friends. Have a great day.